She convinced 5 successful people their futures were interconnected with hers. By the time they realized it, she'd taken everything, $2.3 million. And the strangest part, 2 of them still defended her, called her misunderstood, said she'd changed their lives. This isn't a story about theft. It's a story about what happens when someone understands you better than you understand yourself. When someone positions themselves not as a con artist, but as the only person who truly sees you. Her name was Iris. She operated from Los Angeles in 2021. She used Instagram as her primary tool. She never threatened anyone. She never forced anyone to do anything. She simply listened. And listening, it turned out, was a weapon more effective than any threat could ever be. She knew what you wanted to hear because she'd spent weeks studying your posts, your likes, your stories. She knew what you feared because fear broadcasts itself through every filtered image we share online. She knew what you needed because everyone needs the same thing, to be told that someone understands them. This is the story of how understanding became control, how validation became theft, how connection became fragmentation. This is what happened when someone created an entire false reality and convinced 5 intelligent, successful people to live inside it. Before Iris had followers, she had a father, a man who built wealth the way some people build walls, carefully, methodically, without ever asking if anyone wanted to live inside. He was successful in every measurable way. His business thrived. His reputation was solid. His home was beautiful. And his daughter learned, very early, that love was conditional on performance, not explicitly stated, never articulated, but every achievement was met with immediate redirection to the next achievement. Every success was reframed as the baseline for future expectations. She grew up in material comfort and psychological starvation. Her mother was different, softer, more emotionally present, but emotionally present in a way that demanded constant reciprocation. Her mother needed to be assured that she was a good mother. Iris became the reassurer. By age 12, she was managing her mother's emotional state. By age 16, she was the adult in the family dynamic. By age 22, she'd learned to perform confidence even when she felt profound uncertainty. She moved to Los Angeles when she was 24. She told herself it was for opportunity. The truth was more complicated. She was running from an identity that felt fundamentally fraudulent. In LA in 2018, she could reinvent herself. She could be whoever the market demanded. She'd been performing her entire life. This was simply the next stage. She started with Instagram because Instagram is the platform of performance. It rewards aesthetics and narrative construction. It doesn't reward truth. It rewards the appearance of truth. She began posting about spirituality, tarot readings, numerology, manifestation, not because she was trained or credentialed, because she'd noticed something. People online were desperately searching for someone to tell them their story made sense. They wanted someone to validate the narrative they'd constructed about their own lives. They wanted permission to believe they were special. Instagram made that want visible. Her early content was vague in the way all spiritual content is vague, but her comments were specific. When someone posted about career uncertainty, she responded with uncanny precision. "I'm sensing a major shift in your professional identity. You're at a threshold. You know what needs to change, but you're waiting for permission." They responded, "How did you know?" "Because everyone is waiting for permission. Everyone is at a threshold. Everyone knows what needs to change." By 2019, she had 3,000 followers. By early 2020, as isolation set in and people moved their entire lives online, she had 12,000. By mid-2020, as lockdowns deepened and loneliness became the dominant emotional reality, she had 40,000. People weren't just following her for spiritual guidance. They were following her because she seemed to understand them. Because in her messages, they felt seen. She moved from public posts to private messages. This was the critical shift. In public, she was one voice among thousands. In DMs, she could be completely present. She could respond within minutes. She could ask personal questions. She could make people feel chosen. And as people began feeling chosen, they began opening up, sharing their fears, their financial concerns, their professional anxieties, their relationship struggles. She documented everything, screenshotted conversations, cross-referenced details, built psychological profiles. This wasn't malicious documentation, or rather, it didn't feel malicious to her. It felt like care, like really understanding someone required systematic attention. By the time she made her first major move toward financial manipulation, she had accumulated months of psychological data on her targets. The pandemic created the perfect conditions. Isolation made digital connection feel like the only real connection. Economic uncertainty made people desperate for guidance. The wealthy were particularly vulnerable. They'd built their lives on a sense of control, and the pandemic destroyed that illusion. They became susceptible to someone who promised to restore it. Iris didn't think of herself as a predator. She thought of herself as a guide, and the terrifying thing is, she probably believed it. When you spend enough time constructing a narrative, it becomes your reality. When you perform confidence long enough, the performance becomes the person. Iris had been performing her entire life. Now she was simply taking it to its logical conclusion. The first person Iris targeted wasn't random. His name was Marcus, fictional, a marketing executive at a mid-size firm, 43 years old, recently divorced, publicly successful and privately terrified. In 2020, his Instagram feed told a specific story: professional achievements, carefully curated travel photos, inspirational quotes about resilience. But the comments under those posts revealed something else. He was asking questions. He was uncertain. He was performing confidence while experiencing its complete absence. Iris noticed him because the algorithm noticed him. Instagram's recommendation system isn't random. It's designed to connect people with content that will generate engagement. Marcus had been searching for spiritual guidance, for tarot readings, for anything that might suggest his life was heading in a direction he could trust. The algorithm showed him Iris, and Iris, who understood algorithms better than she understood people, or so she thought, immediately recognized that Marcus was exactly the kind of person she could help. Their first conversation began casually. He'd commented on one of her posts, something about tarot predictions for Scorpios, and she'd responded with a direct message. "I'm sensing something specific about your chart. You're in a major transition. Have you considered a reading?" Most people would have ignored it. Marcus responded within the hour. What made Marcus vulnerable wasn't stupidity, wasn't naivety, was something more fundamental. He was a successful man in a culture that had taught him that success was the measure of worth, and his recent divorce had shattered that metric. He was 43, he'd built a career, he'd accumulated wealth, and none of it had protected him from failure. So when Iris offered to help him understand why, when she positioned herself as someone who could see beyond the surface, who could perceive the deeper patterns of his life, he was desperate to believe her. Iris's method with Marcus was systematic. First, validation. She told him things he wanted to hear, that his divorce wasn't a failure but a transition, that he had untapped potential, that the universe had brought them together for a reason. She was giving him what his ex-wife hadn't: unconditional emotional support, no judgment, no demands, just the sense that someone understood him. Second, isolation. Not aggressive isolation, subtle. She would mention that most people couldn't understand his path, that his friends probably meant well but couldn't see what she saw, that his family would be skeptical of spiritual guidance, but that skepticism came from their own limitations, not from truth. She was creating a world in which she was the only person who truly understood him. Everyone else existed in a kind of psychological darkness. Third, psychological dependency. She began asking him personal questions. What was he afraid of? What did he really want from life? What would he do if he weren't constrained by other people's expectations? She was essentially asking him to construct a narrative about himself, and then she was validating that narrative. She was making him feel like the author of his own story, even as she was secretly rewriting it. By the third month of their messaging relationship, Marcus would wake up and check his phone for messages from Iris before checking anything else. He'd think about her insights throughout his day. He'd screenshot her messages and reread them when he felt uncertain. She had become his primary source of psychological validation. This is where most people would recognize manipulation. This is where the victim should feel the warning signs. But Marcus didn't, because Iris had positioned herself not as an authority figure demanding obedience, but as a partner who saw him. And in the loneliness of 2020, in the isolation of his post-divorce existence, that felt like love. The financial conversation didn't begin with money. It began with possibility. Iris mentioned casually that she'd been offered an opportunity, a real estate investment, something that required capital. She mentioned it almost apologetically, as if she was burdening him by sharing her concerns. And Marcus, who'd been receiving unconditional support from her for months, immediately offered support in return. "How much do you need?" She didn't take it immediately. That would have been too direct. Instead, she deflected, said she couldn't ask that of him. But then, days later, she returned to it, said the opportunity was closing, said she had faith that things would work out, but faith required action, said that if Marcus truly understood what she was trying to do, truly believed in their connection, then perhaps there was a way they could both benefit. Marcus wired her $10,000, not because she demanded it, because she'd created an entire psychological architecture in which giving her money felt like an act of faith in himself. It felt like investing in their shared future. It felt like taking control of his own narrative. This is what made Iris so effective. She never positioned herself as a con artist. She positioned herself as someone with special knowledge, special access, special connection to Marcus's future. And Marcus wasn't stupid for believing her. He was human. He was lonely. He was looking for someone to tell him that the story of his life wasn't a failure, but a transition. And Iris knew exactly what that felt like, because her entire life had been constructed on the same desperate need, to be told that the performance was real, that the false self was actually the true self, that someone understood. While Marcus was sending Iris money and feeling like he was investing in their shared future, Iris was simultaneously running the exact same operation with 3 other people. This is where her psychology becomes most visible. She wasn't greedy in a simple way. She wasn't trying to become rich. She was trying to become real. And the way to become real was to have multiple people confirm her narrative simultaneously. With Marcus, she was a spiritual guide. With her second target, a woman named Jennifer, a tech entrepreneur, she was a business strategist. With the third, a therapist named Dr. Rachel Chen, she was a mentor figure. With the fourth, a man named David, an investment advisor, she was a partner. Each relationship was distinct. Each one had different psychological architecture, but all of them served the same function. They confirmed that Iris existed, that she mattered, that she was the person she'd constructed. The psychological term for this is compartmentalization. Iris maintained 5 different personas simultaneously across different platforms and different victim circles. And the truly disturbing thing, she believed all of them. By mid-2020, she wasn't performing anymore. She was fragmented. With Jennifer, the tech entrepreneur, the hook was different. Jennifer was successful, genuinely successful. But success in the tech world means constant pressure to stay ahead of the market. Jennifer was paranoid that her competitive advantage was eroding. She was vulnerable not to spiritual guidance, but to business validation. Iris positioned herself as someone with insider knowledge. She spoke about investment opportunities. She mentioned connections. She created the impression of access to something Jennifer didn't have. What Jennifer didn't know was that Iris had no actual business expertise. What Iris had was the ability to construct narratives that felt true. She would say things like, "I'm hearing whispers in certain circles about AI companies pivoting to consumer applications. Your company would be perfectly positioned." She wasn't predicting the future. She was describing the present in a way that made Jennifer feel like she had access to secret knowledge. Jennifer sent her $50,000 for an investment consortium. Not all at once, gradually. Starting with $5,000, then $10,000, then $20,000, then $15,000. Each payment felt like a different decision. Each one had a justification. But the pattern was the same. Iris created uncertainty, then positioned herself as the solution to that uncertainty. With Dr. Rachel Chen, the manipulation was even more sophisticated because Rachel was trained in psychology. She should have been able to identify what was happening. But this is where Iris's instinct was brilliant. She positioned herself as a mentor to Rachel, not a spiritual guide. She spoke Rachel's language. She referenced psychology concepts. She created the impression of shared intellectual ground. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Iris would write, "about how therapists often struggle with their own unresolved trauma. I think that's your block. You're holding yourself back professionally because of fear. But I see your potential. I see what you could become if you stepped into it." Rachel was being offered something more valuable than money. She was being offered the possibility of psychological evolution. She was being offered the chance to see herself through someone else's eyes and have that vision be flattering. And she was a trained professional, which meant she was educated enough to rationalize away her own suspicions. By early 2021, Iris had 5 victims sending her money. The total was approximately $200,000. This is when her psychology shifted. She had confirmation. Multiple people believed in her. Multiple people had given her access to their financial resources. Multiple people had literally invested in her narrative. She wasn't performing anymore. She was real. She had to be. Because she had proof. But proof requires continuous confirmation. One victim starting to doubt meant the entire structure could collapse. So she doubled down. She told Marcus about a larger investment opportunity, a real estate development that required significant capital, $300,000. A legitimate investment, she said, one that would mature in 18 months, one that would change his life. Marcus had already sent her $70,000 over several months. $300,000 was terrifying. But by this point, Marcus had rationalized so much, sacrificed so much of his own financial judgment in deference to hers, that he couldn't stop. To stop would be to admit that he'd been wrong, and Iris had spent months convincing him that his problem wasn't stupidity, but fear. If he didn't make this investment, the problem wasn't that Iris was a con artist. The problem was that Marcus lacked faith in himself. This is the psychological architecture of long-term manipulation. It makes the victim responsible for the outcome. If you believe in me, you'll succeed. If you doubt me, you'll fail. If you're hesitant, it's because you're afraid, not because something is actually wrong. Jennifer took out a business loan for $150,000. She told herself it was a strategic move. She told her business partners it was an investment in market research. She told her therapist, not Rachel Chen, a different therapist, that she was just being cautious. All of these narratives allowed her to continue participating in her own financial dissolution without fully confronting what was happening. Rachel did something even more concerning. She liquidated a portion of her retirement account. She was 61 years old. Retirement was no longer an abstract future. It was a concrete reality approaching in a few years. Withdrawing from retirement accounts comes with penalties, tax implications, all kinds of financial consequences. But Iris had positioned it differently, not as a financial transaction, but as an investment in her own psychological liberation. She could either retire as a limited version of herself, or she could take this risk and become the therapist she was meant to be. Rachel chose the latter, because Iris had made her see the choice not as financial, but as existential. And when the choice is framed as a matter of who you are as a person, most people will sacrifice money. Most people will sacrifice security, because identity feels more real than financial safety. By the time Iris had extracted $600,000 from her 5 victims, she wasn't thinking of herself as a thief. She was thinking of herself as a revolutionary. She was helping people transcend their fear. She was facilitating their transformation. That the transformation was fictional, that the investments were fake, that the future she'd promised didn't exist. None of that had fully penetrated her consciousness. She had constructed a narrative in which she was the guide, and the guide exists outside the normal rules of morality. This is what separates Iris from a simple con artist. She believed her own narrative, and belief is contagious. The more she believed, the more her victims believed, until everyone involved was living inside a story that felt true, even though it was constructed entirely from psychological manipulation. There was a moment, in the middle of 2020, when Marcus realized he was in love with Iris. Not romantically, their relationship had never been sexual, but love in the way that people love their therapist, their mentor, their guide, the person who sees them. In his experience, being seen was rarer than being loved. His marriage had ended partly because his wife felt unseen by him. He'd been focused on achievement, on the external markers of success, and he'd missed her internal landscape. She'd felt ignored, and when she finally left, he'd understood too late that what people actually need is witness. They need someone to notice them, to pay attention to the specifics of their interior world. Iris paid attention. She remembered details. She referenced conversations from months earlier. She asked follow-up questions. She created the impression of continuous thought about Marcus's well-being. And in the context of his isolation, pandemic isolation, post-divorce isolation, isolation from friends and family, this felt like the most real connection he'd ever experienced. "I was thinking about what you said last month," Iris would write, "about feeling invisible in your career. I think that's changed. I'm sensing a major shift in your professional frequency. You're becoming visible." And Marcus would feel it. He would return to work with a different energy. His colleagues would respond, his boss would notice, and he would credit Iris because Iris had predicted it, because Iris saw it before he did. What neither of them acknowledged was that Marcus was creating the shift himself. The prediction became self-fulfilling not because Iris had special knowledge, but because Marcus, feeling seen and validated, carried himself differently. He was more confident, more present, more engaged, and that change in his own behavior was what created the external shift. But Iris took credit for it, and Marcus assigned her credit, because in their relationship, Iris was the authority on his own life. Jennifer's seduction was different but equally complete. Jennifer had built her company from nothing. She'd sacrificed relationships, stability, peace of mind. She'd made herself into a successful person through sheer force of will. But success, she was discovering, doesn't actually make you happy. It doesn't make you feel secure. It just makes you aware of how much you have to lose. Iris offered her something different. The possibility that there was a way to have achievement without the anxiety. That there was a path to success that didn't require constant vigilance and struggle. That transformation was possible. I'm sensing that you've been operating from fear your entire career, Iris told her. You've been building a wall instead of a foundation, but I see a version of you that's built on trust instead of control. That's the version that's going to revolutionize your industry. Jennifer wanted this version of herself so badly that she was willing to believe Iris could see it. The version that didn't need to fight for everything. The version that could trust. The version that could rest. Dr. Rachel Chen's seduction was perhaps the most sophisticated because it was intellectual. Iris positioned herself as Rachel's intellectual equal, someone who understood psychology at the deepest level. She would reference papers Rachel had read, theories Rachel had studied, and add slight innovations that seemed brilliant. She was essentially flattering Rachel's intelligence while simultaneously suggesting that Rachel's intelligence had been limited by her training. You know attachment theory perfectly, Iris wrote, but I think you've been applying it too narrowly. I see how it connects to something broader, something about how we construct our identities based on perceived connection. That's your book. That's what you're supposed to write. Rachel had wanted to write a book for 20 years. She had ideas, research, but no framework that felt comprehensive enough. Iris was offering her the framework. And more than that, Iris was offering her the chance to be the person who discovered something new about psychology. Not the therapist who applied existing theories, but the thinker who expanded them. The investments that followed these conversations felt different from con artistry. They felt like collaboration. When Iris asked for Rachel's retirement funds to support research partnerships, it didn't feel like theft. It felt like investment in a shared intellectual project. It felt like Rachel was finally taking her own brilliance seriously. It felt like Rachel was choosing herself over comfort. This is the seduction of being understood. It makes you willing to risk everything because the person who understands you has positioned themselves as worth trusting more than your own judgment. Your judgment has been limited, they suggest. Your instincts have been constrained by fear or convention or trauma. But I see beyond those limitations. I see who you really are. And who you really are is worth every risk. By the time the victims had sent Iris money, they weren't sending it reluctantly or under pressure. They were sending it eagerly, because the money represented faith. The money represented choice. The money represented choosing the person who saw them over the world that had never quite understood them. There was a parallel moment with each of them, a moment when doubt crept in, when something Iris said didn't quite add up, when the investment opportunity seemed less certain than promised, when the timeline shifted inexplicably, when a promised update didn't arrive. And in each case, Iris had a response prepared, not a defensive response, a reassurance. She would acknowledge the doubt and reframe it as growth. I'm noticing some fear coming up for you. That's your old self resisting the transformation. Push through it. Or she would create urgency. I need you to make a decision quickly. The opportunity is closing. I can't hold it open much longer. This is your moment to choose yourself. Or she would create exclusive access. I shouldn't be telling you this, but I trust you completely. This investment is only available to people I personally vet. Most people would never have access to this. Each doubt was met not with proof but with psychological insight. And the victims, trained by months of Iris positioning herself as psychologically sophisticated, accepted the insight as true. They accepted that their doubt was their limitation, not her failure. By mid-2021, Iris had extracted approximately $1,800,000 from her 5 victims. She had not yet been caught. She had not yet been exposed. And in her mind, she had not yet failed. Because in her narrative, she was still the guide. The investments were still real. The future transformation was still possible. It was just taking longer than promised. Her victims were beginning to question her, but they were questioning her gently, because they'd been trained to question themselves first. By fall of 2020, Marcus had sent Iris a total of $680,000. The investment in the real estate development was supposed to have seen returns by now, but Iris had explanations. Construction was delayed, permits were held up, there was a dispute with a contractor. Every problem was plausible, every delay made sense, but collectively they added up to a pattern that Marcus's conscious mind was starting to recognize even as his psychological dependence was fighting against recognition. He started asking questions, not aggressively, carefully, because he'd been trained to frame his own doubts as his limitations. But he asked nonetheless, "When should I expect the first return? Can you send documentation for the LLC? What's the project address?" Iris's responses became less immediate. They became vague in new ways. "The documentation is complicated by the corporate structure. I'll send a summary when things are finalized. The address isn't public yet for security reasons. And then, I'm noticing some anxiety in your energy. That's your old self trying to maintain control. Trust is about releasing certainty." This is where the manipulation became most visible and most cruel. Marcus's doubt was being used against him. The very act of questioning Iris was reframed as his psychological limitation. If he could just trust more deeply, if he could just let go of his need for control, everything would make sense. But something had shifted in Marcus. The pandemic had gone on longer than expected. His job had become more secure, not less. His emotional state had stabilized somewhat, and in that stabilization, he was beginning to see the architecture of what Iris had constructed. He was beginning to recognize that the validation he received was contingent, that it only came when he accepted her narrative without question. He did something that terrified him. He showed their messages to his sister. He said casually, "I've been getting some spiritual guidance. Just wanted to get another perspective." His sister read through months of conversations, and she said simply, "This isn't guidance. This is manipulation." Marcus felt physically ill, because his sister was articulating something he'd been afraid to articulate himself. He'd known, somewhere deep down, but knowing meant confronting the fact that he'd been fooled, that he'd been vulnerable, that the person he'd trusted most had been systematically exploiting that trust. He confronted Iris. "I need documentation, real documentation, bank statements from the LLC, proof that this investment actually exists." Her response was what broke the spell. "If you can't trust me at this level, then maybe we shouldn't continue this relationship." It was a masterful move psychologically. By threatening to end the relationship, she was forcing him to choose, abandon the investment and the person who understood him, or pretend his doubts didn't exist and continue. But the threat had the opposite effect. It revealed something Marcus had been unable to see before. Iris's entire investment in their relationship was conditional on his continued compliance. The understanding had never been real. The care had never been real. It had all been architecture designed to keep him compliant. He asked for his money back. Iris said it wasn't possible. The funds had been deployed. They were invested. They would be returned when the investment matured. When was that? Unclear. Dependent on market conditions. Dependent on things beyond her control. Jennifer's moment of recognition came differently. She had taken a business loan for the investment Iris recommended. The loan came with monthly payments, and by early 2021, she was facing a cash flow problem. The business was doing well, but the loan payments, combined with Iris's promised returns never materializing, were becoming untenable. Jennifer reached out to a friend who worked in real estate investment. She asked casually about the project Iris had mentioned. The friend said, "I don't know of any project like that, and the way you're describing it, the LLC structure, the timeline, the promised returns, that sounds like a Ponzi scheme." Jennifer's response was similar to Marcus's: denial, followed by confrontation, followed by the devastating realization that she'd been used. She'd taken a business loan and handed it to a con artist. Her company's financial future was now dependent on returns that would never come. With Rachel Chen, the realization came through a different channel. One of her therapy clients mentioned, casually, that they'd been following a spiritual advisor on Instagram. The description sounded familiar. Rachel asked for the name. It was Iris. The client said, "She's been asking me for money for investments. She said she saw something special in me. Is she legitimate?" Rachel experienced a moment of psychological vertigo. because she recognized in the client's description the exact same manipulation that had been happening to her. She was hearing herself described, and suddenly she could see it. Not the manipulation happening to her, but the manipulation that had happened to her. She went to her financial advisor. She discovered that the research partnerships she'd funded didn't exist. The retirement account withdrawals had been for nothing. She had lost $410,000. She had encouraged a client to question someone who was manipulating that client, and she had not questioned the exact same person when that person had been manipulating her. The shame was catastrophic. Rachel Chen was a therapist. She was trained to identify psychological manipulation. She was educated in psychological patterns, and she had failed to see it in herself. She had failed to protect herself. She had failed to do the thing that was supposed to be her professional purpose. By October 2021, all 5 victims were aware of the deception, but their responses were not uniform. David, the investment advisor, immediately reported Iris to authorities. He was angry. He was humiliated, but he was clear-eyed about what had happened. Marcus initially did not report her. He wanted to keep it quiet. He was ashamed. He was worried about his professional reputation. He was also experiencing something more complicated. He was grieving the loss of the person he'd thought Iris was. Even knowing the truth, part of him wanted to preserve the fiction. Jennifer tried to recover the money through her lawyer. But there was a problem. Iris had been careful. The money had been transferred to offshore accounts. The documentation was minimal. The trail was obscured. It would take years to pursue through the legal system, and even then, recovery was uncertain. Rachel did something more drastic. She attempted suicide. She'd been prescribed antidepressants by her psychiatrist. She'd been referred to a colleague for therapy, because of course the therapist who'd been manipulated needed a therapist. She'd been devastated by shame and self-blame and the profound awareness of her own limitations. She survived. And in surviving, she did something important. She chose to speak publicly about the manipulation. She identified herself as a victim. She began writing about the psychology of how experts can be manipulated. And in doing that, she began to rebuild. This is where doubt transforms from personal failure into something more profound. Recognition. The moment when the victim stops blaming themselves for being fooled and starts seeing the system that enabled the fooling. The moment when shame transforms into clarity. But it takes time. And in the time between recognition and clarity, all 5 victims experienced something that Iris never accounted for. Grief. Not for the money, though that was devastating. Grief for the loss of the person they'd thought Iris was. Grief for the version of themselves that had believed. Grief for the trust that could never be recovered. They had been taught, by Iris, to see themselves as the problem, and unlearning that was going to take years. If there was a single moment when Iris's narrative completely collapsed, it happened in late September 2021. Marcus had stopped responding to her messages. Jennifer had blocked her. David had gone to the police. And Rachel had done something that truly terrified Iris. She'd reached out to the other victims. Rachel constructed a timeline. She shared it with the others, and collectively, they began to see the architecture of what had happened. The same investment opportunities offered at different times. The same explanations for delays offered with slight variations. The same psychological tactics deployed with different targets. What Iris hadn't anticipated was connection among the victims. She'd kept them isolated, convinced each one that their relationship with her was unique and special. But once they connected, once they compared notes, the uniqueness disappeared. The specialness dissolved. What remained was a pattern, a system. Iris's response in the weeks after her network began collapsing was to double down. She created new Instagram accounts. She reached out to her remaining followers with new promises. She told them that there was a coordinated attack against her, that people who were jealous of her success were trying to discredit her. She positioned herself as a victim, and remarkably, some people believed her. Not the 5 major victims, but others on the periphery who'd sent smaller amounts of money. They believed that Iris had been attacked. They felt defensive of her. They became her advocates. But the collapse was accelerating. Jennifer's lawyer had contacted the FBI. David's police report had been filed, and federal investigators began to trace the money. They discovered that the offshore accounts led back to Iris. They discovered that there was no real estate investment, no business opportunity, no research partnership. There was only a woman who had created fictional narratives and extracted money from people's vulnerability. When federal agents showed up at Iris's apartment in October 2021, she was still operating. She was still convinced, in some deep way, that the narratives were real. When confronted with evidence, her response was almost confused. She kept saying, "But I was helping them. I was guiding them toward transformation." She was arrested. She was charged with wire fraud and conspiracy. And the victims finally had proof that it hadn't been their imagination, that the doubt they'd felt had been justified, that the person they'd trusted had been lying all along. But here's where the story becomes even more psychologically complex. Marcus and Jennifer both experienced something unexpected after Iris's arrest. They felt worse, not better. The reason was this: as long as Iris was free, as long as there was a possibility that she might somehow complete the investment, complete the transformation, return the money, there was hope. As long as Iris was still out there, the narrative could still resolve itself. The money could still materialize. The person they'd been told they could become could still be real. But with her arrest, hope died. The narrative was closed. And they were left with the full weight of what they'd lost, with no possibility of recovery, with no redemption for the person they'd trusted. Jennifer used some of the settlement money from her lawsuit to pay off the business loan she'd taken. She didn't recover the full amount. Iris's assets were liquidated, but the money was split among multiple victims. Jennifer recouped roughly 40% of what she'd lost. Marcus never fully recovered. He'd withdrawn from his company. He'd moved to the East Coast. He'd essentially started over. He was 60 years old now. He'd lost $680,000 that he'd hoped would fund his retirement. Instead, he was working past the age when he wanted to work. Rachel recovered differently. Her attempt suicide had clarified something for her. She wanted to live. She wanted to understand herself. She wanted to help other people understand the psychology of being manipulated. She began speaking at conferences. She wrote papers. She testified at Iris's trial. And Iris, in custody, experienced something that was perhaps psychologically consistent. She didn't fully accept responsibility. She acknowledged the charges. She accepted the legal reality. But psychologically, she maintained elements of her original narrative. She'd been helping people. Yes, the money was real. Yes, the investments hadn't materialized. But the intention had been genuine. She had believed in the transformation. The court didn't accept this narrative. She was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. She'll be released in 2030, in her mid-40s, with no career prospects and no narrative that makes her story coherent. What's most striking about Iris's psychological state during and after her trial is this: she was angry, but not at herself. She was angry at the victims who'd reported her. She felt betrayed by them. In her narrative, they were supposed to understand that she'd been helping them. They were supposed to be grateful, even after the money was lost, because the money was secondary to the growth. This is the final element of long-term manipulation. Even when it's exposed, the perpetrator rarely experiences genuine guilt. Instead, they experience themselves as the victim of ingratitude, the victim of misunderstanding, the victim of people who couldn't see the larger purpose. The victims, meanwhile, spent years rebuilding, not just their finances, though that was important, but their ability to trust their own judgment, their ability to believe in connection, their ability to see another person and not immediately question whether they were being manipulated. This is the hidden cost of psychological manipulation that financial recovery can never touch: the erosion of the capacity for genuine trust. Once you've been exploited, it's harder to believe that anyone else isn't also exploiting you. Once you've been fooled, it's harder to take the risks that genuine connection requires. Yet the victims slowly learned something that Iris never seemed to understand: the capacity to be manipulated and the capacity for genuine connection come from the same place. Both require vulnerability. Both require openness. Both require the willingness to believe in something beyond your own certainty. The difference is this: genuine connection builds, manipulation extracts. But the opening required for both is terrifyingly similar. In the weeks following her arrest, Iris sat in a holding cell and tried to reconstruct her narrative. She maintained journals. She wrote letters to her victims, to her family, to the judge overseeing her case. And in all of them, a consistent theme emerged. She wasn't a thief. She was someone who'd made choices that happened to be illegal, but the illegality wasn't the essence of what she'd done. I genuinely believed I could make the investments real, she wrote to Marcus. I believed that if I could just find one person who was willing to trust deeply enough, I could generate enough capital to make everything real. I know that sounds delusional now, but in the moment it felt like faith. This is the psychological truth about long-term con artists. They often genuinely believe their own narratives. The deception isn't simple lying. It's a kind of psychological fragmentation where the narrative becomes more real than reality, where the person you're pretending to be becomes, in some deep way, the person you are. Iris's journals reveal something else. Moments where she almost confessed. Moments where she contemplated telling the truth. And moments where she talked herself out of it. If I admit to Marcus that the investment doesn't exist, it means I'm a fraud. It means everything I've told him is a lie. It means I'm not the person I've been. And if I'm not that person, then who am I? This is the part I can't face. Not the crime, the identity dissolution. This is where the psychology of manipulation intersects with something deeper. The psychology of a person who's never had a stable sense of self. Iris had been performing her entire life. Her parents had taught her that love was conditional on performance. She'd learned to become whatever people needed her to be. And when she came to LA, she simply expanded that skill into a full professional operation. The con wasn't primarily about money. It was about confirmation. It was about having multiple people simultaneously validate the narrative that she was real, that she existed, that she mattered, that her guidance was valuable. When the victims began to doubt her, the entire psychological structure was threatened. And instead of confessing, instead of facing the truth, she did what she'd always done. She performed differently. She offered new narratives. She created new investment opportunities. She reached out to new victims. She expanded the con to prove to herself that the original con had been real. Each new victim was essentially a rejection of reality, and each victim who eventually reported her was, in Iris's mind, a betrayal. They were supposed to keep believing. They were supposed to maintain the narrative that made her real. The victims, meanwhile, experienced her arrest very differently. For Jennifer, it was vindication. She'd been right to doubt. She'd been right to question. The shame she felt wasn't entirely lifted, but it was redirected. The shame belonged to Iris, not to her. For Marcus, it was more complicated. Part of him felt vindicated. Part of him felt devastated. He'd wanted, in some way, for Iris's narrative to be real. He'd wanted there to be a person who truly understood him, and her arrest was proof that there wasn't. The person he'd connected with was entirely constructed. For Rachel, Iris's arrest was the beginning of recovery, because once Iris was in custody, Rachel could start the work of understanding how she'd been manipulated, how her professional training had made her vulnerable rather than protected, how expertise in one area, psychology, had left her completely blind in another. Recognizing her own manipulation, Rachel eventually published a paper, The Therapist as Victim: How Professional Training Can Reinforce Psychological Vulnerability. In it, she explored the ways that trained professionals are sometimes more vulnerable to manipulation than laypeople. They understand psychological concepts intellectually, but often haven't integrated them emotionally. They know the theory of defense mechanisms but don't always recognize their own. She wrote, I could identify projection in my patients. I could see how cognitive dissonance was preventing them from seeing reality. But when it came to myself, I was blind. Not because I wasn't trained, but because my training gave me a false sense of immunity. I thought understanding psychology protected me. Instead, it just gave me better tools to rationalize my own denial. David, the investment advisor, used his experience to become an advocate for financial literacy and fraud awareness. He started a nonprofit that educated people about psychological manipulation in financial contexts. He became, ironically, a guide, but a guide who taught people to question authority, including himself. Jennifer never fully recovered her professional confidence. She kept her company, but she scaled it back. She didn't trust her judgment the way she had before. She'd been successful, and that success had made her vulnerable. Now she was more cautious, less visionary, safer. And Marcus simply became quiet. He moved to Vermont. He worked a simple job. He didn't pursue wealth. He didn't pursue romance. He withdrew from the parts of life that had made him vulnerable to Iris in the first place. In doing so, he also withdrew from the parts of life that required vulnerability, connection, aspiration, trust. The cost of Iris's manipulation wasn't simply the money stolen. It was the fundamental erosion of the victim's ability to take risks in relationship. It was the years of therapy, It was the broken trust in their own judgment. It was the life structures they'd had to rebuild. And what's perhaps most important to understand, none of this was hidden. All of this was visible to Iris when she was operating. She knew her victims were sending her money they couldn't afford to lose. She knew Marcus was withdrawing from his savings. She knew Jennifer had taken a business loan. She knew Rachel had tapped into retirement funds. She knew the cost, but she rationalized it as necessary. She told herself that the victims would eventually understand, that the transformation would justify the cost, that once the investments matured, the money would be returned, and the victims would see that they'd been right to trust her all along. This is the final element of psychological manipulation that separates it from simple theft. The manipulator often genuinely believes they're helping the victim, not as a cover story for external audiences, but in their internal narrative. They've reframed the extraction as offering, the con as guidance, the theft as investment in the victim's future. Iris maintained this belief even in prison, even facing 9 years incarceration. Even after the trial, she wrote to Rachel, "I know you believe I was deliberately harming you, but I was trying to help you become who you were meant to be. The money was secondary. The transformation was what mattered." Rachel never responded to the letter. She read it once. Then she filed it away. She didn't destroy it, though. She kept it as a reminder of something important, that the manipulator's belief in their own righteousness is often absolute, that conviction and malice can coexist, that someone can genuinely want to help you while systematically exploiting you, and that the difference between a guide and a thief sometimes comes down to whether they're willing to stop when questioned, whether they're willing to face reality when confronted, whether they're willing to sacrifice their own narrative for the truth. Iris was never willing to do any of these things, and so the guide became the thief, the mentor became the con artist. The person who understood them became the person who'd been using them all along. The victims learned gradually that this was always the possibility, that the person who understands you most deeply is also the person who can hurt you most deeply, because understanding is power, and power without constraints always tends toward exploitation. Iris is currently incarcerated in a federal facility in California. She's maintaining a blog. Prisoners are allowed limited internet access for educational purposes, and she's still attempting to maintain her narrative. She describes herself as a guide who made mistakes, rather than a fraudster. She frames her incarceration as an opportunity to reflect on the psychology of manipulation. She's written a guide to spiritual development, which she's submitted for publication. Even in prison, even after conviction, even with clear documentation of her crimes, Iris cannot fully accept her own culpability. This is not unique to her. This is a consistent pattern across psychological research on perpetrators of long-term manipulation. The ability to maintain a counter-narrative even in the face of overwhelming evidence. What's important to understand about Iris's story isn't what makes her extraordinary. It's what makes her ordinary. She wasn't a criminal mastermind. She didn't have extraordinary intelligence or special training. She had something simpler and more dangerous. She had psychological access to people who wanted to be understood, and she had the willingness to exploit that access. In 2021, as Iris was being prosecuted, she was simultaneously becoming a case study in a broader phenomenon, the psychology of digital intimacy and manipulation. She'd operated on Instagram, but Instagram was just the platform. The actual mechanism was simpler. She'd offered connection in an age of isolation. She'd offered understanding in an age of performance. She'd offered guidance in an age of uncertainty. And these aren't special offerings. Everyone is offering these things. Instagram influencers offer connection. Self-help authors offer understanding. Spiritual leaders offer guidance. The difference with Iris was simply this. She weaponized it. She transformed the offer into an extraction. But here's what makes the psychology of this particularly complex. The extraction doesn't work if the victim doesn't participate. The money doesn't transfer itself. The trust doesn't build without the victim's investment. In that sense, the con is not something that happens to the victims. It's something that the victims do, with the con artist, together. This is where victim blaming becomes dangerous, because saying, "they should have seen it coming," misses the point. The point is that human beings need connection, human beings need understanding, human beings need guidance, and these needs are real and legitimate, even when they're exploited. The problem isn't that the victims needed these things. The problem is that someone existed who was willing to use those needs as tools. The The psychological research on manipulation consistently shows that the most effective con artists aren't the ones who target the stupid, they're the ones who target the vulnerable. And vulnerability isn't stupidity, it's openness. It's the capacity for connection. It's the willingness to believe in another person's goodness. In the case of Iris, her vulnerability was particularly acute because they were all operating in a specific moment in history, the pandemic. Isolation had become the default. Digital connection had become the only connection, and the loneliness had reached crisis levels for most people. Iris took advantage of that. But so did therapists. So did online communities. So did anyone offering connection during lockdown. The difference was that Iris also extracted money. But the mechanism, the psychological mechanism, was the same as any form of digital influence. This is what the victims gradually came to understand. They weren't stupid for being manipulated. They were human. They were lonely. They were looking for someone to tell them their story made sense. And there was nothing wrong with that. The wrong was in Iris's willingness to exploit it. Marcus eventually articulated this in an interview. "I don't regret that I was open to connection. I regret that there was someone willing to use that openness against me. But the openness itself, that's not something I want to lose. I just want to be more careful about who I trust with it." Jennifer took a different approach. "I learned that success doesn't protect you. Education doesn't protect you. Intelligence doesn't protect you. The only thing that protects you is critical thinking, not cynicism, just the willingness to question, to ask for proof, to accept that the people you admire might be lying to you." Rachel's conclusion was the most sophisticated. "I learned that the biggest vulnerability is the assumption of immunity. I assumed my training protected me. I assumed my expertise meant I couldn't be fooled. But the truth is, the people most vulnerable to manipulation are often the ones who believe they're immune to it, because that belief prevents them from applying their own critical faculties to the person manipulating them." And David, the investment advisor, who recovered fastest because he'd immediately reported Iris, "The difference between manipulation and guidance is accountability. A guide accepts the possibility that they're wrong. A manipulator insists they're right, even when confronted with evidence. That's the line." This is what emerged from Iris's case across the 5 victims, an understanding that manipulation isn't about intelligence or naivety. It's about a specific relationship between a person offering something that feels true and a person who wants to believe it. The con works because both parties are participating in the construction of the narrative. The difference, the crucial difference, is that a legitimate guide is willing to be wrong. A legitimate mentor is willing to admit uncertainty. A legitimate teacher is willing to be questioned. And a legitimate person, in a legitimate relationship, is willing to say, "I don't have all the answers. I might be wrong. Let's figure this out together, not together with me as the authority." Iris never said any of these things, and that's where the guide became the thief, not at the moment of the first financial extraction, but at the moment she decided that her narrative was more important than the truth, that her identity as a guide was more important than the actual well-being of the people she was guiding. This is what the viewers of Velvet Traps are meant to recognize in themselves: the capacity for both, the capacity to guide and the capacity to be guided, the capacity to understand and the capacity to be understood, the capacity to help and the capacity to hurt, and the understanding that the difference between these, between integrity and manipulation, isn't something inherent to the person. It's something they choose moment by moment. It's something they choose when someone questions them. It's something they choose when they're confronted with doubt. It's something they choose when the narrative they've constructed starts to crack. In those moments, they either choose to face reality, or they choose to deepen the lie. Iris chose to deepen the lie, and in doing so, she became the very thing she'd been performing: a con artist, a person more committed to the illusion than to the truth. The 5 victims, in different ways, learned to recognize when they were beginning to do the same, when they were beginning to deepen a lie to protect an identity, when they were beginning to value their narrative more than reality, and they learned to stop. That learning, that capacity to stop, to turn around, to face what is true, is what separates the victims from the perpetrator. Not intelligence, not training, not circumstance, just the willingness, when confronted, to choose reality over narrative. This is the question Velvet Traps leaves with you. When you're confronted with doubt about someone you trust, what do you choose? Do you deepen the narrative? Do you defend the person? Do you blame yourself for doubting? Or do you choose to face what's actually true, even if it means losing the person you thought they were? This is what could happen to anyone, not because anyone is stupid, but because everyone is human, and human beings, by design, are vulnerable to connection. We're built to trust. We're built to believe. We're built to want to understand and be understood. The question isn't how to become immune to manipulation. The question is how to remain open to connection while maintaining the willingness to see clearly. How to trust without demanding that trust be rewarded. How to be vulnerable without demanding that vulnerability be protected. It's the hardest thing in the world, and everyone at some point will fail at it. The only difference between those who recover and those who don't is whether they're willing to look at what happened, whether they're willing to acknowledge both their openness and their betrayal, whether they're willing to grieve what they lost without losing the capacity to love again. Iris will be released in 2030. The question her story leaves us with isn't about her. It's about us. It's about what we do with the understanding we gain from her existence. Do we become more cynical? Do we become more guarded? Do we close ourselves off to the possibility of genuine connection? Or do we become more discerning? Do we learn to notice the difference between someone who wants to understand us and someone who wants to use us? Do we learn to question without assuming the worst? Do we maintain our capacity for trust while keeping our eyes open? The victims chose the latter. And that, perhaps, is the only real redemption available in a story like this. Not that it didn't happen, but that it was survivable. That understanding it was possible. That moving forward without cynicism was an option. This is what Velvet Traps explores. Not how to avoid being hurt, but how to survive being hurt and remain capable of connection. How to understand psychological deception without losing faith in the possibility of genuine relationship. How to see the thief and still believe in the guide. The answer, like everything in psychology, is more complex than any simple rule. But it begins with this: paying attention, asking questions, trusting your doubt as much as your faith, and understanding that the people most capable of harm are often the people most capable of help. The difference is whether they're willing to stop.